The Lekgolo are perhaps the most unique species in the Halo universe, demonstrated through their various colony forms composed of individual worms who gather in large numbers to form a collectively minded colony. And while their temperament may sometimes be volatile in the midst of combat, they are equally sophisticated and honor-bound creatures, making them just as formidable an ally as they are foe. And much like the other species who made up the now disbanded Covenant, their purpose and allegiance has changed drastically in recent years, now split between the Banished, Swords of Sanghelios, as well as the other Covenant remnant groups. But even with their continued deployment, the overall current state of their species and home system is unknown. For today's video though, let's explore the known, and discuss the lore behind the Lekgolo species, addressing their unique physiology, homeworld, history, culture, and society as a whole. And while this is only the third entry in my species profile series, I just wanted to remind you guys that your support on the other videos has been much appreciated. So for anyone who might be new, please don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of this kind of content in the future. And when we're done here, be sure to check out the other two videos where I've covered the Jiralhane and Sangheli. But without further ado, let's dive directly into the lore of the Lekgolo. The Lekgolo are best described as a pseudo-annelid species, being worm-like creatures who gather in large colonies. These colonies, or communities, are often referred to as subsistence gestalts. In terms of differences between male or female specimen, it is entirely unclear if the Lekgolo even have a male or female, biologically speaking, meaning that all Lekgolo look virtually identical, granted that they are from the same gestalt. There are several known subsistence gestalts or variant colonies of Lekgolo, those being the Mgalekgolo, Dipholekgolo, Rhuolekgolo, Sbaolekgolo, Khantolekgolo, and the Thanolekgolo, some of which have varying levels of documentation, while others are known only by name. But when taking a closer look at those we do have images of, one might notice their drastically different features. Take for instance the Rhuolekgolo in comparison to the Mgalekgolo. The bodies are relatively the same, but with the Rhuolekgolo, we can see the presence of tendril-like appendages and a bulbous face structure. With the Mgalekgolo though, we see an almost arrow-shaped head with no sort of appendages present. One thing that all Lekgolo do share though is their segmented serpentine bodies, which are generally covered in a slimy, thick reddish-orange skin. The same color can also be seen in their luminescent blood, which is a clear indicator of their high-iron, metal-focused diet. Another byproduct of this is that they are known to emit a smell likened to burnt plastic. It is also known that they can survive in harsh environments indefinitely, such as the vacuum of space, with little to no resources, drawn of course from the fact that they have inhabited Tay's orbiting moons and satellites for untold generations. Probably the most important aspect of understanding the Lekgolo is that while the individual worm does technically possess a low level of intelligence, it is not until they've joined together into a colony that they develop any sense of advanced thought, or by extension, a sense of self, as a colony is the closest thing there is to an individual within the Lekgolo species. These traits only emerge due to the melding of their neural and synaptic tissues through a process of chemical and electrical exchanges, essentially creating one giant neural network which compounds the collective intelligence of each worm present. And technically, there is no limit to the level it could reach. It is only limited by the nutrients required to maintain it. Now, why the Lekgolo need to form a complex neural network at all in order to manifest individual thought is unclear. But it's because of this odd phenomena that the Lekgolo gestalts are otherwise immune to flood infection, being that while the individual worm does indeed have a central nervous system, their combined colony does not. So this unique melding of synaptic and neural tissues is actually what makes them incompatible with the flood's method for infection. If the Lekgolo were separated from one another though, they could technically be infected, but they would likely just be used for biomass, as in the instances where infection has occurred, the flood was documented as unsuccessful in recreating the Lekgolo's unique ability to form into gestalts. While we don't know the average life expectancy for the individual Lekgolo worm, the colonies or individuals they make up could technically live indefinitely, should they continually produce new offspring. An example of this longevity of a colony can be seen with the Mgalekgolo leader, Colony, as these Bond brothers are said to have been born on the moon of Rantu in 2310, which would now make them 250 years old. And when taking into account their over 2 millennia of service to the Covenant, it's entirely possible that there are colonies still active who are even older, especially when you consider the Gestalts who traditionally never saw combat. The species also has an oddly unique ability to integrate with technology near seamlessly, similar to the bioorganic Hurigok species, which was notably developed by the Forerunners. Now, if the two have any relation to one another, though, is unclear. And it is never directly said what reproduction looks like for the Lekgolo, and since it's unclear if they possess male or female biology, one might argue that they are actually a hermaphroditic species, and reproduce similar to Earth's worms or slug species, meaning any Lekgolo inherently possess all genetic material necessary to develop offspring. Now, whether they undertake that process alone, or do indeed need the participation of other members of their colony, is unclear. The only thing we really know about reproduction is that it takes anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks. The Lekgolo species is believed to have originated somewhere within the orbit of the massive blue giant known as Te, which is the 5th planetary body in the Sphere system. The world measures 54,157 miles in diameter and has a gravitational pull 4 times stronger than that of Earth. And from what we understand, Te has no surface, but retains an atmosphere composed primarily of nitrogen, helium, and methane. Temperatures in this soupy gaseous environment can range anywhere from -4 to 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Along with its moons Uta, Rantu, and 23 other natural satellites, the planet is orbited by a series of artificial planetary rings, appropriately called the Rings of Te, which are the remnants of several ancient Forerunner orbital complexes. Something also worthy of note is that the Lekgolo's last population estimate in their home system was 1.98 trillion, and of course, this number does not include the individuals who were in service to the Covenant at the time, making the Lekgolo perhaps the most prolific sapient species in the Milky Way galaxy, at least in the modern era. Now, the location of the Lekgolo homeworld was no secret within the hierarchy of the Covenant, but due to the world's heightened gravity and dangerous orbital debris, the gas giant was an undesirable and seldom traveled destination. Because of this, the location of the Sphere system was largely not included in standard navigational databases within the Empire. So, as yet another consequence of the Covenant's downfall, any charted routes there were either lost or remain hidden away in the remote archives of High Charity's remains. The history of the Lekgolo is largely unknown before their introduction to the Covenant, even amongst the members of their species. All we can say for sure is that they had evolved from indigenous life on one of Te's moons, feeding on its abundance of minerals and rare metals. And much like the other sapient species of the modern era, their ancestors were stumbled upon by the Forerunners in ancient times, going on to be cataloged as part of their ongoing preparations for the firing of the Halo Array. One such Gestalt of the ancient Lekgolo that the Forerunners had shown great interest in was the Thanolekgolo. This Gestalt was closely studied and went on to be used in a failed experiment to defeat the Flood, but it is not known what exactly went wrong or why this plan was abandoned. All we know is that the specimen involved were contained and then buried beneath the surface of Installation 04. When the array was finally fired, all Lekgolo were of course seemingly killed off, with the index specimens being reseeded to the moons of Te many years later. In the millennia following their reseeding, the Lekgolo re-established their populations and went on to develop a means of space travel. However, the exploration of their home system was severely limited due to Te's heightened gravity, but they did eventually discover long-abandoned Forerunner complexes orbiting the gas giant, which when colonized provided an abundance of minerals and metals for the Lekgolo to consume. Though some populations did not partake in the destruction of these complexes, and chose to eat anything but Forerunner artifacts. And for the next several millennia, these ancient complexes were almost completely broken down, with their fragmented remains going on to form the Rings of Te. Fast forward to the year 789 BCE, when the Covenant would be led to Te in search of Forerunner artifacts. But when they discovered that the Rings of Te were in fact the remains of the Forerunner constructs they had sought, and that the Lekgolo were to blame for their destruction, the San Shayum quickly declared war on them for their heresy. This ensuing conflict with the Lekgolo would prove bloody and fruitless, as ground combat against them was all but unwinnable. Their coordination, strength, ferocity, and sheer numbers overwhelmed the Sangheili in every way, leading to losses in nearly all ground engagements. And given the Covenant's refusal to harm the Forerunner relics that the Lekgolo called home, there was no clear end to this conflict in sight. It was only after the intervention of the Arbiter of that era, jet lekmuti, that a solution was devised. After being sent to traverse the moon of Rantu and study their species for 1 year, the orbiter bore witness to the strength and ferocity of the Mgalekgolo Gestalt firsthand, and when his travels had concluded, he began to campaign for an alliance with them. In his travels, he had learned that there were populations who did not partake in the consumption of Forerunner artifacts, and believed that they could target them, reasoning with them, and in time, add the beast to their ranks. The prophets agreed, seeing that the benefits of such an alliance far outweighed the continued conflict. Shortly after, peace was brokered, and the Lekgolo were officially absorbed into the Covenant Empire. The first years of this collaboration were difficult, but the Lekgolo were fully incorporated into the Covenant by the year 784 BCE, with several of the 6 documented Gestalts present being put to use. This period of time would later come to be known as the taming of the Lekgolo. Seeing as the Lekgolo were the first species to be annexed into the Covenant following the Writ of Union, they would go on to experience over 2 millennia of discovery and conversion of other species, standing alongside the Sanghili at every new encounter, rebellion, and conflict. But it wasn't until the discovery of and declaration of war against humanity in 2525 that the Lekgolo's honor and allegiance to the Sanghili would eventually be tested. Something important to note is that the Covenant had just concluded the 23rd Age of Doubt, a period of time where the Empire had experienced dissent in many ways and an overall growing lack of faith in their great journey. In those previous years, as well as the ones to follow, the Sanghili had become increasingly paranoid over the Sanshayum's growing favoritism of the Jiralhane, in some cases granting them privileges or roles that had exclusively been held by the Sanghili for thousands of years. But this all came to a head in 2552 when the Prophet of Truth had put in motion a meticulously coordinated ejection of the Sanghili from the military, ordering all Jiralhane forces to execute their Sanghili commanders as well as any member of the High Council. This event would spark a civil war known as the Great Schism. And while there were Gestalts who continued to collaborate with the Covenant, the species as a whole largely stood with the Sanghili. More specifically, staying loyal to those Sanghili peers that they had served alongside during the Human Covenant War. And in the post-war era, this trend continued, as the emergence of several Covenant remnant factions split their allegiances further, with notable commitments to Jewel and Dama's Covenant, the Banished, albeit it's unclear if this is voluntary or forced, and the Swords of Sanghelios, with there even being some colonies known to work alongside UNSC forces. As of 2560, the Lekgolo are still actively serving the various Covenant remnant factions, with no real indications of trying to distance themselves from conflict. It is also unclear if the Lekgolo have any desire at all to, or at least have attempted to, re-establish contact with their home system, which as we know, the location of was all but lost with the fall of the Covenant. But in recent years, leadership within the Banished has shown an interest in recovering that data from High Charity's remains, as they are keen on recruiting new colonies and studying whatever might remain of Tay's Forerunner orbitals. Now, if you remember from earlier in the video, you'll recall that I had mentioned that the Forerunners attempted to weaponize a population of Thanolekgolo against the Flood, but ultimately failed in some way. They then buried them under the surface of Installation 04, never to be seen again. But following Alpha Halo's destruction back in early 2552 by Spartan 2 John 117, it was revealed that these specimens actually had survived. Not only their thousands and thousands of years of containment, but also the firing of the Halo array itself. So while they were once forgotten, the ring's destruction allowed them to escape onto certain areas of the ring, specifically a fragment known as Alpha Shard. And while this shard had been propelled through slipspace into the orbit of a red giant, these native Lekgolo were relatively unfazed by the new extreme daytime temperatures, burrowing underground or hiding in crevices, only really emerging at night. But in 2556, their existence would be revealed during a joint operation between Oni and the Cedran Colonial Guard when their expedition team encountered this overly aggressive variant. While they were nearly successful in hunting down and consuming nearly every member of the team, they were ultimately neutralized by retired Spartan 2 Randall 037 when he detonated a Havoc nuclear device. Lekgolo culture is a poorly understood topic to say the least, mostly due to their reclusive nature and severe lack of interest in sharing any information on it. So all we have really comes from the observations of other species who have served alongside the Mgalekgolo. And in all honesty, even to a multi-species organization such as the Covenant, many of the other races were often perplexed by the Lekgolo, feeling their existence and way of life was as alien to them as the Floods, noting that one moment they might be meditating and reciting war poetry, and the next, tearing their enemies apart with their bare hands. One thing rather apparent, though, is their dismissive and scornful attitude towards other species and enemies they deem as lesser, with the Mgalekgolo in particular known to show no remorse over friendly fire or trampling over species such as the Kigyar or Ungoi. This goes for communication and interactions as well, with the exception being of course the Sangheili, whom the Lekgolo respected greatly, holding a strong sense of brotherhood with and appreciation for their knowledge and adeptness in combat. In terms of religion, the Lekgolo have never displayed any sort of connection to one pre-Covenant, and rather than adopting a belief in the Great Journey, they instead joined the Covenant for access to trade routes and starships. Even while they don't necessarily believe in the Covenant's version, it is understood that some do actually believe in an afterlife. One thing that truly held high cultural importance for their species was the tasks that their subsistent Gestalts held, with their involvement with foreigner artifacts or military significance giving them an importance that no other races could provide. Starting with the Dipholekgolo, from what we understand, they were initially designated as an exploration-centered colony, carefully cultivated by the Sanshayum to assist in the mapping of the Anodyne Spirit, which was the Forerunner dreadnought located at the center of High Charity. In 2559, though, it was seen that their use had shifted drastically, as the Banished had employed them as operators for the Clavrig Workshop Skitterer. Being a support vehicle design originally proposed by Sanshayum technicians, the ideas of such use were abandoned due to the risk of emergent behavioral issues. Though, with the direct leadership of Swarmlord Colony, the wide-scale deployment of Lekgolo-assisted vehicles such as skitterers has become a reality. Next, we have the Sbaolekgolo, which are known as a metacolony, being a slightly altered collection of Dipholekgolo Gestalts. This variation specializes in the operation of large harvester platforms such as the Zazayara pattern harvester, which rarely saw deployment due to their size and weight. They were intended to be used in long-term military deployments or in search of foreigner artifacts, but again, were so rare that they had only been encountered by humanity for the first time in 2558. The Mgalekgolo, being perhaps the most recognizable, yet ironically one of the smallest Gestalts, is easily the most documented. Having been known as the most resilient and powerful unit within the Covenant military, this Gestalt manifests into a bipedal, armor-clad beast, which on average stands over 12 feet tall and has incredible sensory capabilities within their environment, not even needing to look at their enemies, as they can simply sense their presence nearby. These hunters, as they are called by humans, are most commonly outfitted with an arm-mounted assault cannon and massive shield, which was traditionally made from the same alloys used in the hull of Covenant warships. In rare cases, such as on low-gravity worlds, these colonies had been documented to grow large enough to produce a form several stories tall. Though under normal circumstances, colonies will split into two once they've reached an appropriate size, with those resulting colonies sharing an extremely close and mysterious connection. This connection allows them to almost telepathically communicate with one another, or at the very least, sense the other's intent without communication. In the event that one of these brothers die, though, the others have been known to go into a berserker rage, lashing out on anyone in their path, friend or foe. And while their deployment style, rankings, and appearances have remained relatively unchanged over the millennia, the most changes have really occurred in the last decade, especially the years following the Human Covenant War. One of these such changes was seen during that brief period of time following the slipspace event above New Mombasa in 2552. This is where we saw a limited deployment of colonies with gold-colored harnesses and an altered cannon type. Whether they had a true designation within the Covenant is unknown, but they are often referred to as the Flak Hunters. They also act as an example of Mgalekgolo who were loyal to truth immediately following the Great Schism. Even more recently, though, there have been a number of new forms and rankings which have emerged within the Banished. Such examples would be the Ardent Mgalekgolo, who are the longest serving of their kind within the Banished, outfitted with red harnesses, overclocked assault cannons, and a noticeably stronger shield, often tasked with the defense of convoy routes, command barracks, excavation sites, and so on. There is also the Mgalekgolo Scarred, which are long-lived veterans of the Covenant's wars, who are exclusively deployed by Swarmlord Colony. And of course there are the Mgalekgolo Ironclad, which are outfitted with significantly more armor plating, and are also members of the multi-species Ironclad subpack of the Banished. There are also hunter captains, which are a larger, energy-shielded, heavily armored colony who acts as a commander unit for nearby Lekgolo. Another unique trait is that they also share a direct link to the Swarm Lord colony. And lastly, there are also Goliaths, which are an even larger, more aggressive Mgalekgolo form that is the result of two bond brothers combining into one colony. Trading their shield and arm-mounted cannon for a quadrupedal stance, this configuration was traditionally only seen in times of danger or with feral colonies, likely due to the adverse effects that the form can have on the two combined brothers, as it creates a ravenous hunger for nutrients and the repurposing of a large portion of the colony into strong cords of pseudo-muscle. This transformation significantly dials back their cognitive and sensory functions as their focus shifts almost exclusively to raw strength. Alright, so coming back to the other Gestalts, we also have the Rhuolekgolo, who are documented as specializing in the operation and piloting of excavation platforms similar to the Sbaolekgolo. However, their use spans to several variants including the Protos pattern, Deuteros pattern, and Sumdate pattern scarabs, ranging from actual excavation purposes to military use. It is unclear how natural this Gestalt is, or at least how similar they are to those originally discovered by the Covenant, as over the millennia, they were documented as being artificially engineered to better fit their role. In recent years, though, they have also seen deployment by the Banished in the assisted operation of Barukaza Workshop Scarabs and Locusts. Now for the Thanolekgolo, their use within the Covenant or its other remnant factions is unknown, as their study by the Forerunners and their reemergence on the Alpha Shard is all we really know about them. But they are noted as being one of the 6 original Gestalts found by the Covenant, with their aggressive nature and consumption of Forerunner alloys probably being the limiting factor in their collaboration. And finally, we have the Khantolekgolo, who are really an enigma, as they are the only Gestalt listed from the original 6 that we know absolutely nothing about, be it if they had any use within the Covenant, or even what they looked like. Any records were of course lost with the fall of High Charity. Something also worthy of note in this section is the Slugmen, which were a pruned family of Lekgolo whose true name is unknown. Having been rarely encountered by humanity, but also within the Covenant, this Gestalt was a small colony of Lekgolo worms who acted in special purpose sniper roles. Clad in powered exosuit and often equipped with a Verkschütz pattern particle rifle, reports indicate that they were sporadically assigned to Sangheili military and expedition teams, functioning similar to Kigyar snipers. This is just my speculation, but I wonder if this Gestalt has any connection to the elusive Khantolekgolo, or is yet another form manifested by one of the other Gestalts, such as the Mgalekgolo. But we may never know. Outside of the use cases I have already outlined, the Banished have continued to find new uses for Lekgolo regardless, with some actually being detrimental to their health. One such example would be the deployment of Lekgolo in Banished caltrops, with these Lekgolo not only acting as obstacles, but also as communication nodes that alerts the Banished to the presence of enemies. Now, it's not exactly said why or how this is such an incredibly hard task for the Lekgolo to do, but it is known that it significantly decreases their lifespan. Similarly, there are also Lekgolo clusters who are known to be deployed as a means of increasing operational capabilities of vehicles, being referred to as vehicle symbiotes. And again, this is my speculation, but it is very possible that these 2 additional roles may not necessarily be specific to any Gestalt, but it would definitely make more sense if they were, as that's kind of on brand for the Lekgolo. Either way, whichever Gestalts fill these roles has not been established. Each of the individual Gestalts may have their own unique norms or societal significance to the Lekgolo species, but as mentioned in the previous section, our understanding of anything regarding these topics is almost exclusively based on observations of the Mgalekgolo. But what we do know is that the Lekgolo do not necessarily have a spoken language, but instead communicate through physical connection between one another or by wriggling and vibrating their bodies, which can create a deep resonating sound. Translations of these vibrations are rudimentary and vague, with most interpreting them as statements of comfort, recognition, meditation, or even the recitation of war poetry. Yet without the presence of a translator device, the Lekgolo are largely unvocal, rarely attempting to use their version of speech to mimic the odd word or sentence of another language, with the exception being Sangheili. But in some instances, they have been known to produce the occasional chuckle after a kill, or even an animalistic roar when engaged in combat. Building on language, Mgalekgolo naming conventions have revealed that an individual or colony has 3 names, those being a personal name, bond name, and a line name. The personal name is given at birth or when a colony is first established. The bond name is a shared name between bond brothers, and the line name represents the genetic heritage of a colony, being the name of one of its most successful ancestors, meaning that if their own colony reaches a certain level of status, its future offspring will implement its personal name as their line name, continuing the cycle. Examples of Mgalekgolo names include Igido Nosa Huru and Ogeda Nosa Fasu, with Igido or Ogeda representing their personal names, Nosa being their shared bond name, and Huru and Fasu being their line names, meaning either of the two might have been the first of their lineage to implement a notable ancestor's personal name. Alternatively, an example of a colony that does share a common line name would ironically be Colony, with the 2 individual bond brothers being named Ilu Kadu Bakso and Nado Kadu Bakso. Here, both share the line name of Bakso, meaning their predecessor must have been really freaking cool. These 3 names can be written as separate words or altogether as one and are still correct either way, but it is unknown if these same naming conventions carry over to other Lekgolo Gestalts. Seeing as there are various members of their species actively serving different Covenant remnant groups, we can assume that the Lekgolo do not particularly partake in any form of unified species-specific government, meaning that they do not collectively work to further their species as a whole despite their hive mind classification. Instead, they seem to act only on the orders of local Lekgolo colonies with greater significance or whatever individuals they call their superiors. And for the Lekgolo, at the top of this hierarchy of significance, there are the Swarm Lords, a title that denotes elder Mgalekgolo colonies who have demonstrated the ability to act of their own volition. One example of a Swarm Lord might be the Bond brothers Myriad, who were responsible for the deaths of not 1, but 2 separate Spartan 4 fire teams that were neutralized by the Master Chief on Installation 07 in 2560. In this case, Myriad had developed a heightened sense of identity and intelligence outside of what we normally see with Mgalekgolo, not only acting autonomously, but also displaying a sense of authority among the Lekgolo around them. This sort of behavior may stem from a recent evolution within their neural net, or simply come with age. The Bond brothers' colony displayed an even further evolution of this on Installation 00, as they were able to almost completely influence any Lekgolo under their command. Now, this is just my own speculation, but the only way I see this being possible is if the Bond brothers actively seed their subordinate Lekgolo colonies with worms from their own stock, creating a unique connection similar to what Mgalekgolo Bond brothers share. And since I've never really seen a discussion on whether or not different Gestalts can directly interface with one another, this may just be an underdeveloped talking point for someone at Halo Studios to visit in the future. Food for thought, that's all I have to say. And lastly, while there's almost no information on the subject, I will mention that there has been reference to clans of Lekgolo, specifically seen when reading the recent lore entries surrounding Myriad, with these 2 Bond brothers being said to be members of a clan, the Horde Worms of Sphere. All we know is that this clan originates in the Sphere system, and given that this concept was really only recently established, this could be a byproduct of the Lekgolo being members of the Banished, as the Jiralhane-focused nature of the group may have influenced them to want to identify as members of a distinct grouping. But of course, that's just a theory. In conclusion, what we know about the Lekgolo species is actually pretty limited, and often shrouded in mystery, with the only clear information we have depicting them as an incredibly unique, diverse, adaptive, and formidable race. From the earliest days following their reseeding of their homeworld, their discovery by the Covenant, or their ongoing contributions to the conflict on Zeta Halo, the Lekgolo have experienced seemingly endless conflict. And when their loyalty was tested during the Great Schism, they largely stood by their time-tested allies, the Sangheili. But when it comes to understanding if they have any motives, or if the Banished will re-establish travel to their home system, what comes next is unclear. But with that, we have come to the end of this installment of my Species Profiles series, and I'll end with saying I've always loved the idea of doing a video for the Lekgolo, and it was super exciting to finally get this scripted, recorded, and then of course obviously shooting the B-roll for it. So even though this video took a long time, and thank you guys for your patience, and even though I'm sick right now, hopefully it doesn't sound as bad as I think it does, this video was monumental for me to get out. I'm very thankful to the writers within the Halo franchise, the team who works on cannon fodders, obviously, or the books even. So again, just thank you guys for giving me this opportunity to share information with others, as well as thank you, my viewers, for watching this video, and it means the world to me if you've made it this far. So with that said, if you guys have made it this far in the video, please be sure to leave me a like, and if you're new, please don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more of my content. And if you'd like to be somebody that keeps up to date on everything LoreWithWes, please be sure to turn on the notification bell and keep an eye on the community section for bonus content and updates. But hey, that's enough talking, so I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.